What is going on, everybody? We're doing another Dirty Dozen, and this time of the Philidor. Philidor is e4, e5, knight f3, and then black makes the subtle move of d6. We're going to push forward with d4. Black will not capture, but they're going to develop their knight to d7 rather than c6, because if they went c6, they could get kicked with d5. So, knight to d7, and we're going to go ahead and bring our bishop out to c4. And now black pushes c6, looking to push d5 soon enough. That's when we want to jump our knight to g5, doubling up the attack on f7. And that's when the knight jumps to h6, because it's the only piece that can defend it other than the queen and king. We want to burn a turn and go ahead and castle. Black wants to go ahead and castle as soon as possible, so all it has to do is develop its bishop, and it only has one square on e7. That's when we go ahead and jump our knight to e6, attacking the queen. Black's going to go ahead and accept the sacrifice, and that's when we go ahead and capture the knight on h6. And if black recaptures our bishop, they are in some no trub. That's when we can go ahead and slide our queen to h5 with check. They have only one move, king to f8. And now we take the e6 pawn with our bishop, and we're threatening queen f7 checkmate. If the king evades on g7, queen f7 would be checkmate. And if it brings the queen over to e8, looking for an exchange and protecting the f7 square, queen capture h6 will get her done. On to the next. Very similar to the last trap, e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight d7, bishop c4, and then that early c6 push again. From here, we're going to bring the knight to g5. They're going to bring their knight to h6. Last trap we castled, but this time we're still going to burn a turn, but it's a4, and we'll show you the deal. Black is still going to push e7, just like last time, and from here, instead of bringing the knight to e6, hitting the queen, we're going to kamikaze the bishop on f7. If the king just wants to move, then we have knight e6, check, and then we pick up the queen once the king moves or captures the bishop. So most likely, the bishop is going to get captured by the knight. After that, we're going to still bring the knight to e6, hitting the queen, and it's got two squares it can go to. If it goes all the way to a5, then we have bishop d2, stopping the check and striking back. The only position that is safe for the queen to go to is b6. a6 would run into knight c7 with the family fork. So b6 is the way to go. And then we can push a5, hitting the queen again. And now the queen has more or less two moves it can go to. If it goes to b5, then it runs into the family fork again. So it's got to capture b2 if it wants any chance, but it's pointless because bishop c3 traps the queen. And that's all if the queen ends up at a5. Now, if the queen ends up at b6 instead of a5, we got some more shenanigans. We can just push a5 and we hit the queen again. So now the queen has more or less two safe squares. One of them is not so safe. It's the b5. That's the family fork it runs into. So it's got to go to b4 with check. Bishop will come back to d2, hitting the queen. And now there's two moves. There is queen to c4, and then queen capture b2. We already know what queen b2 runs into. Bishop c3 trapped. So let's talk about what happens on c4. Knight jumps to c7 with check. King runs to d8 or f8. Doesn't matter. Then we push b3, and the queen has nowhere to go other than to capture the d4 pawn. And then once it does, knight to e6, check, hits that queen once again. That's a beautiful one in my opinion. On to the next. In this trap, it's going to start the same, e4, e5, knight f3, and d6. We're going to push d4, and the first knight will come to d7. After we bring our bishop to c4, the other knight will pop out on f6. Alarm bells ring. That means that we capture e5. And if the knight on f6 captures e4, we bring the queen up to d5, and we're causing two threats. We're attacking the knight on e4, and we're threatening checkmate with queen to f7. Their best defense is queen to e7, and after that, we capture the knight. If they capture the pawn, just go ahead and castle. It would not be a mistake if you captured it. And after you castle, if the knight captures either your knight or your bishop, you just want to recapture with your queen. You'll have an excellent game from here. On to the next. This trap is almost identical to the last. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight d7, bishop c4. Then you got knight to f6. Alarm bells go off. We capture e5. Last trap, they took the e4 pawn. This trap, they take the e5 pawn. And that's when we capture the knight with ours. And upon the recapture, we kamikaze bishop on f7. Now, I highly doubt anyone's going to capture that bishop and leave their queen hanging. So when they step up here to e7, we capture that queen. Once they recapture, we keep our bishop just as is, and we develop our knight to c3. You can also do f3, and you can castle, or knight to d2. If you castle, be warned, the knight might take your e4 pawn. Move your rook over. If the knight backs up, you get the pawn. If it backs up to d6, hitting your bishop, move your bishop back to b3. There's no piece that can protect that pawn. None. The bishop covers the two spots that the knight should be able to jump to. And if they go ahead and back up the knight, push the pawn, kick it out. Once it kicks, two things you can do. I mean, you can either come in and take the pawn with the rook, and if they take your bishop, you take their bishop, or you can kind of boogie with the bishop and bring it back to protect the c2 pawn, because their light squared bishop is hitting it up pretty good. Before we wrap up this trap, we do have to talk about the possibility that that king does capture the bishop. Go ahead and capture their queen, and their bishop, if they know what they're doing, will come to b4, checking your king. You got to bring your queen back to block the check so you don't lose it, and a piece for blocking the check. Their bishop will capture, and you want to recapture with the knight because the knight protects the e4 pawn. Bada bing, bada boom. Enjoy. On to the next. Good things come in threes. This is just like the last two traps. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight d7, bishop c4, and then knight to f6. This setup, just like the last two times, should set off alarm bells. Gotta go ahead and take that e5 pawn. The first of the three traps that are like the same took the e4 pawn. The second was taking the e5 pawn. This takes the e5 pawn, but it does it with the d6 pawn. They're all different. This one, you want to bring the knight to g5, threatening to take the f7 pawn. Black has two main responses. The first being bringing the knight to b6, attacking your bishop. There are two good moves from here. The first being queen captures queen, and basically the line goes that way. We're not going to be covering that line. We're going to be discussing bishop to f7 check. King has to march to e7, and that's when we pick up the queen. Once the king recaptures, we get our bishop back to b3, getting ready for our knight to go in. Black has two main options. The first being bishop to b4 check. We're going to push c3, and then regardless of where the bishop goes to, then we're going to fork the king and rook with our knight on f7. King's going to move, and then we pick up the rook. End of story. The other option, instead of bishop b4 check, the king is going to come to e7, So when we go ahead and bring the knight in for the fork, the rook can kind of evade the death sentence. It can go to g8. If the e5 pawn is there, we want to always bring the knight to e5. If they do this whole, shenanigans where they move the rook back, we want to jump right back in and try to hit it again with the knight. If it does it again, then we want to bring our knight to g5. If the rook moves again, we want to just kind of chill as is. We want to develop our other knight, and we'll go from there. When we capture the e4 pawn, if the rook doesn't move to the corner, it also has the move bishop e6 because the king protects it. Gets in the way of us capturing the rook. We don't want to capture it. Instead, we just want to protect the e4 pawn with either f3 or bringing the knight to c3. d2 is also technically acceptable. On to the next. This next trap is pretty interesting. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, and d4. If black tries pinning your knight early, which is a big mistake because you can just capture the pawn, and they can't recapture right away because the whole queen take queen, king take queen, knight capture pawn, you're a pawn up, and you're threatening to kill the bishop and fork the king rook on f7. Their only decent move is bishop e6, saving both. So, rather than capturing the pawn, they have to capture your knight. You recapture with your queen, and now they can get their pawn back on e5. But we set up a scholar mate type attack with bishop to c4, doubling up on f7. Their best move is probably queen to f6, hoping that you attack so they can recapture with a developing move. But if they make the mistake of just natural development, knight to f6, slide your queen to b3, and now you got two threats. Queen b7 and bishop f7. They can't handle both. Their best move is queen d7, defending the f7 pawn, and after you come in and take the b pawn, they can put their queen on c6, but that's a huge mistake. It does save everything in the corner, and it's protected by the knight, but you have bishop b5 pinning that queen against the king, and you win the game. On to the next. This is a pretty nifty, swifty trap. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, and black pushes f5, the Philidor counter gambit. We take on e5, and they capture e4. We get our knight out of trouble, jumping it to g5, and that's when black pushes d5, opening up the lanes for their dark squared bishop. From here, we develop our knight on c3, complements the two pawns in the center, and black pins it with bishop b4. We go ahead and push e6. It's defended by our knight, so the bishop can't capture, and that defends the f7 square. So we can get our knight in there, forking the queen and rook. Before anything, black trades off our knight on c3, and we recapture the bishop with our b pawn. From there, we are looking to fork, and black has one move. The only move which does protect f7, besides the king and queen, is this dubious looking move, but it does its job, knight to h6. We bring in our queen to h5 with check. They can't block with the knight. That would be checkmate. And they have two moves to move to. e7 is no good because knight capture e4. Looks like you're just disposing of it, but if they were to recapture, bishop takes the knight, and now there's nothing preventing our queen from jumping in and finishing the job on f7. So their best bet is going to f8. That's when we can bring our bishop to a3, attacking the king. It's pointless to throw away the c pawn, and more or less, if they were to run to g8, queen sacrifice on f7 would be checkmate in 1. The knight has to recapture. E captures f7 is checkmate. The only other move that they have is taking the queen and blocking on d6 or e6. Doesn't matter which square they go to, we're going to go ahead and capture it with our bishop, and we're going to have an excellent game. On to the next. Very similar to the last trap, e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, and the Philidor counter gambit is played again. f5 is on the board. D captures e, and f captures e. We jump our knight up to g5, and that's when black pushes d5, getting their d-pawn out of harm's way. We go ahead and push e6, and black, to protect the f7 square, plays knight to h6 again. We're going to develop our other knight to c3, and black is going to play c6 with a big pawn chain looking to push him. And from here, we have a nice sacrifice, knight to e4. And if black captures, we don't want to trade out our queens. We then bring our queen up to h5 with check. Now the knight can't block it, and neither can the bishop or anything else other than the g-pawn, so g6 is pushed. That's when we swing our queen over to e5, and we hit the rook in the corner. And this is when I'm going to pause the video and turn on the analysis and let it catch up, because I want to show you the numbers in the variations, just so you don't question why I'm not showing a certain thing. Because there is no specific winning a queen or a fork or a knight. There's a lot of different combinations that could happen, but very few lines on the low end of the numbers. Rook to g8 is the proper move, getting out of harm's way. And right here, it's not even showing up the proper move of bishop to g5 on the radar. It's showing a big fat goose egg. So I'm going to let this run a little deeper, because it's definitely the move to be. There it goes. Bishop g7 is the proper response. It took depth 20 to run that one. e7 is the answer to being attacked on our queen, is to attack theirs, and they wouldn't be able to recapture since our bishop has its back, and we would get the queen again. Real quick, I'm going to run through the top 3 lines from here for black. Queen d2 check, king take. They take our queen, and then we get the knight. We'd be up a minor piece and a good game to be had. Runner-up move, queen to d5. We'd bring our queen over to c7. They'd take out our knight, and we'd recapture. They'd bring our bishop, doubling up on the d1 square, but we got a rook in the corner, and we can go ahead and grab the knight, and that would be a minor piece up, and we'd have an excellent game. And last but not least, the best move would be queen to d7. We'd want to play queen f4. They'd bring the queen in proximity. We'd bring our queen over to c7. They'd bring their bishop to e5, hitting our queen, and that's when we would put our queen on d8, check. The king would have to go to f7. We'd go ahead and capture the knight. The rook would come over, attacking our pawn. Point being, we're going to have an excellent game. Haven't grabbed a minor piece yet, but it can go many different ways from here. Leaving it at that, on to the next. Very nice trap here. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight d7, bishop c4. And here the knight goes to b6, hitting our bishop. So we tuck it back to b3. That's when e5 captures d4, and we don't have to take it with the knight, since our queen really can't be kicked back other than with c5, leaving black with a backward pawn. It's probably not going to happen. Queen comes to f6, looking to trade, and we go, nope. Bishop comes, hitting our knight. If trade, we would double up on the f. We're not looking for that, right? So that's when we go ahead and move our bishop to g5, striking out at the queen, leaving our b2 pawn exposed. And if black moves the queen and takes it, they foobarred up. Queen to b5, check. No matter what they do, let's say they block it with, pushing c6, so we got to move our queen again. We sacrifice our bishop on f7, check, and after they take care of that, we pick up the queen. Dope. On to the next. e4, e5, knight f3, and black decides to push d6 instead of developing a knight. And from here, different variations, but I'm going to cover a trap which I found to be the coolest out of all of them because there's just so many different variations, and no matter what black does, they are fucked. So after bishop c4, the bishop will go to e7, and then we push d4. E captures d because obviously they don't want to let us capture because then the queens will get off the board. And we recapture on d4 with the knight. And if they play knight to d7, game over. We're going to start the treachery with bishop capture f7 check. If the king chooses not to capture the bishop, knight to e6 rechecks them, and after they're forced to take the bishop, we're going to grab the queen, and it's going to be an excellent game. So if the king does take the bishop, we're still going to come in with our knight on e6 and attack the queen. The king can't take the knight because queen d5 check, the king is forced to f6, and then queen f5 is all she wrote. So the queen has two options. It can take what's coming to her, or she could try to evade and go to e8. And it doesn't end well either way, regardless. We're going to jump our knight to c7 and attack the queen again. And she can either take what's coming, or they can go left or right. Let's see what happens if they choose to go right first. We want to bring our queen to h5 with check. They got two options, running and blocking. They got one piece to block. If they do, then we swing our queen over to d5 checking. King has two squares to go to. If it chooses g7, the knight jumps to e6, checking the king. Once the king moves, regardless of the square, we pick up the queen. Now, if the king chooses to go to f6, then we bring our dark squared bishop to g5, checking the king. Now the king has to go to g7. Then we jump our knight to e6, checking the king and queen again. Now the king only has one square to go to. When it chooses there, we go ahead and pick up the queen. Now, that was in the case that they blocked. If for some reason they chose to run, then we just bring our queen over to f5 with checkmate. That's if the queen marches right to f8. Now we got to choose if it goes to d8. And this is actually checkmate in 8, and it starts off with queen to d5. They don't have any pieces they can block the check with, but the king does have 3 squares he can run to. If it goes to f6, queen f5 is checkmate. If the king ends up going to g6, same thing. Queen f5 is checkmate. Now, if the king backs up to f8, we got to now jump our knight to e6 with check. Now, this is move 10, and black has two choices. If it chooses to go to e8, then we jump our knight to g7 with check. We do not take the queen. And now the king is forced to go back to f8. We jump our knight right back to e6. And the whole point of that was taking out the g-pawn, because now the king's got two options. If it goes to e8, queen h5 is checkmate. And if it goes to f7, then we bring our queen over to h5 with check, and it's got two choices. f6, we go f5 checkmate. If it ends up taking out the knight on e6, same thing. Queen f5 is checkmate. So now we got to back up to move 10 and talk about what happens if the king chooses to go to f7. We want to start off this time with bringing the knight to g5, and now the king has 4 choices. Let's do them one at a time. e8 is queen f7 checkmate. f8 is queen f7 checkmate. And if the king Ola goes to f6, then we have queen f5 checkmate. The only one that extends it on for 4 more moves after this next one is if the king goes to g6. Then we want to still start it off with queen to 5, and the king's got two choices. If the king goes h6, then knight f7 will put her away. And if the king goes to h5, then we push g4. If the king goes north, same thing. We put her away with that knight f7 move. And if it goes south, then we go knight to f3. King's got to go down to h3. Then we can push g5 with a discovery check with the queen. King's got to go to g2. And then finally, rook g1 is checkmate. That was a pretty interesting little trapola, in my opinion. And now we can go ahead and move on to the next. Surprise, surprise, there's also a legal trap in the Philidor defense. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, bishop to c4. And if the bishop comes in to pin your knight on g4, go ahead and develop the knight to c3. Totally ignore that. We're not pushing the d pawn in this. If black pushes a6, preventing your pieces from going to b5, go ahead and try taking the e5 pawn. If black knows this and just captures the knight and doesn't take your queen, go ahead and capture the bishop on g4 with your queen, and you're going to be up a solid pawn. But if black takes the bait and captures your queen with the bishop, you take your bishop, f7 check, king has to go to e7, and then knight to d5 is checkmate. On to the next. What Philidor trap video would be complete if it wasn't for Morphe versus the Duke and the Count? It wouldn't. And I say this all the time. I just wing this shit. I don't have any notes. I'm laying in fucking bed just doing this with, laying down, honestly. Regardless, e4, e5, knight f3, and then the Philidor is d6. We push d4, and then the bishop comes out pinning the knight to g4. We capture e5, and black can't capture back because the whole queen swap thing. So first they got to take out the knight, and after we recapture with our queen, then they can get their material back. We bring the bishop out to c4 in a scholar mate type attack, and that's when black brings out the knight to f6. We slide over the queen to b3, doubling up the attack and also hitting the b7 pawn. Queen comes to e7, protecting the f pawn and temporarily forgetting about the b pawn. That's when we bring out our knight to c3. And black will push c6, so the queen can now access the b7 square. We bring out our bishop to g5, pinning the knight. And that's when black pushes b5, attacking our bishop. The knight kamikazes and captures the bishop, suicide style, and the c-pawn goes ahead and captures the knight. We recapture the pawn with the bishop, and that comes with check. And that's when the knight goes and blocks it on d7. We go ahead and castle long, and that adds an attacker to the knight on d7. And that's when the rook slides over to d8, adding a defender. We go ahead and take out the knight with our rook, and black recaptures with the rook. Since it can't with the queen, because it would lose to the bishop, and it can't with the knight either, because the knight is currently pinned by the other bishop. Once the rook recaptures, we go ahead and slide over our other rook, adding to the attacker, since that rook is now pinned on d7. And now the queen gets unpinned by the knight and slides to e6 and offers an exchange with our queen. And this is the beaut right here. Bishop capture, rook check. And now the knight is the one to recapture on d7. Queen to b8 check. Looking to suicide. And when the knight recaptures on b8, since it is forced, black has no other move. Rook to d8 is checkmate. That concludes the Dirty Dozen for the Philidor defense. And drop a comment. Let me know what you guys think, or if you have any suggestions for the next Easy Dirty Does It. And I do appreciate every last one of you. You take the time to watch my videos, and I hope that you learned something. See you on the next video.